Today we're going to make a cabinet for shoes. The shell of the cabinet is going to be made out of 3/4 inch thick plywood. I had the nice guys at Home Depot cut a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of plywood into 3 14-inch wide strips. I used my compound miter saw to cut the strips of plywood into the appropriate lengths. I'll be posting dimension drawings for this project on my website. If you don't have access to a compound miter saw, a circular saw will work as well. The vertical supports for the cabinet are going to be made by gluing 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood together. I didn't have that many clamps, so I just glued 2 of these panels together at a time. Once the glue had dried for the panels, I clamped 3 of them together and I cut out some recesses for a back support. I set the blade of my circular saw to the same depth as the thickness of the plywood. I then made a series of cuts in the area that I wanted to remove. These little slivers of plywood can be removed with either a chisel or a Japanese hand saw. I used an orbital sander with 60 grit sanding pads to smooth down the recess that I had just cut out. I laid out both the top and bottom pieces of plywood, and then I marked the location for a hole that's 5/8 diameter. This is going to be for a piece of copper pipe, which is what I'm going to use to make the hinge. I used some long clamps to help me hold the cabinet together while I glued and screwed it. The first few pieces went together easily. The bottom pieces were a little bit more tricky though, because I couldn't just put the screws all the way through the lengths of the vertical supports. So I had to screw in from an angle. I inserted in a piece of 1/2 inch copper pipe and then marked where it came flush with the top of the cabinet. I then cut the pipe using a tubing cutter. I used my orbital sander to sand down the front face of the cabinet. I measured the inside distance of the large cabinet opening and then cut a whole bunch of pieces of scrap wood to that length. These scraps came from all sorts of other projects, included things like tropical hardwood decking, solid oak flooring, fir trim boards, and even 1/2 inch furniture grade plywood. Once I had a bunch of pieces cut, I just kept playing around with different compositions until I found a design for the door that I really liked. I sanded all the pieces so they'd be nice and smooth before I started assembling the door. I'm going to use 2 small strips of 1/4 inch thick plywood to hold the back of the door together. I pre-drilled a series of holes that would make it easier to screw the plywood straps to the scrap pieces of wood. The door is going to pivot and rotate around the 1/2 inch copper pipe, so I need to sand down the edge that runs along the pipe so it's a little bit curved so it doesn't pinch against the sides of the cabinet. I wanted a little bit of color in the project, so I decided to paint the back support. But I didn't want it to be completely opaque, so I watered down some latex house paint so that it became a little bit thinner. I used a wet rag to rub off just the amount of paint that I wanted so that you could still see the wood grain. I used 1/2 inch copper pipe straps to connect the door to the copper pipe. The back support fits right into the grooves that we cut, and I then just screwed it into place. I don't want the door to swing too far in, and I also don't want it to swing open. So I installed an eye hook into the side of the cabinet and then epoxied a magnet that'll stick to the eye hook on the inside of the door. This project would be great for an entryway or mudroom because you can store shoes and stuff in it, but it's sturdy enough that you can sit on it like a bench. For more detailed instructions, check out my website, and if you want to see what I'm working on next, be sure to follow me on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.